We are going to look at an example of how to subtract polynomials. In this particular example, we will be looking at two trinomials. So a trinomial has 1, 2, 3 terms. So we will be taking a trinomial and we will be subtracting another trinomial. Now this process can be generalized to work for any type of polynomial. So it doesn't have to be a 3 by 3. It could be any other type as well. And what we're going to do is we are going to drop the parentheses around the first. So for our first polynomial, we are just going to bring those 3 terms down. Then we will distribute the negative sign to the second. So we're going to take this subtraction or negative sign, distribute it to our second parenthesis, the second polynomial, and finally we'll combine like terms. So we'll take it step by step. And here we go. So our first polynomial, the x squared plus 4x plus 3, we are going to drop it down, and we're not going to change anything about it. Let me write that a little here. So it's going to be an x squared plus 4x plus 3. So we're just going to rewrite that without the parentheses. Now our second step is going to be taking this negative sign or subtraction and distributing or multiplying it by every term inside the parentheses behind it. So and there's a couple of ways I'll show you to do this. If we have a negative times 5, will give me a negative 5x squared. So the negative is going to affect the coefficient in front of the x squared. It's not going to change our variable at all. Now this negative times the negative 5x, so if we're multiplying these two, we're distributing, negative and negative will be positive 5x. And then negative with a positive 2, negative times positive is negative when we keep our 2. So that's one method where you're just looking at like a negative times the positive coefficient or a negative times the negative coefficient. Another way that people sometimes like to do it is go ahead and put like a negative 1 there. And then you're thinking about multiplying those two numbers, like negative 1 by 5. So negative 1 times positive 5 is negative 5. And again, you're always going to keep your variable component the same. So don't change that. Negative 1 by negative 5, positive 5. Negative 1 by positive 2 would be negative 2. And then the last way is just if you kind of look at what happened here, just kind of logically, we had this minus in front. So if I remove, let me see if I can take that 1 off. Okay. If I have a negative here, what I'm really doing is I'm subtracting the entire polynomial, all 3 terms. So if we look at what happened, this was a positive 5. It's now a negative 5x squared. This was a negative, it now becomes positive 5x. This is a positive 2, it now becomes negative 2. So you're really changing all signs in that parenthesis behind it because you're subtracting each of those terms. Okay, so that's, I would recommend picking one way, the one that makes the most sense to you, and use that, practice using that method for all your problems. I wouldn't switch it up every time because that gets a little confusing. Okay, so thus far we have done the first part here. We've dropped the parentheses and rewrote the first polynomial. Then we distributed the negative sign to the second, and we wrote what those values were. And now our last step is going to be combining like terms. So what are like terms? Like terms are when you have the same variable raised to the same power, okay? So if you have x on both and they both have a 2, these are going to be like terms. Similarly, if you have x and this would have an understood 1, then those are going to be like terms. And then we called the terms without x's a constant because they're constant, they don't change. But they're numbers. So if you see terms with just numbers, no x's, those also go together, okay? So I'm going to go through and we'll just work it out together slowly. So our first set of like terms will be our x squareds. Now this 1 here in the front, this has an understood 1 in front of it. So if there's not a coefficient, we can write it as a 1. There's an understood 1. There's just 1x squared. And if there's not a sign, it's going to be that positive. So if you want to put it there, it's fine. You don't have to. And then I like to bring them down, put them next to each other, if you would like to do that. And now we'll go ahead. I like to go ahead and finish this up while I have it here. 1x squared minus 5x squared. When we combine like terms, we add or subtract the coefficient, the number in front, as indicated, but we keep our variable the same. So I'm going to take 1 minus 5, and that gives me negative 4, and you keep the x squared, because it's like saying, hey, I've got one of these, I'm taking away 5, I now have negative 4 of them, okay? Going to our next set, we have an x to the first and an x to the first. So just like this 1's understood to be in front of my x squared term, there's an understood exponent of 1 on these x's. Now, you don't really need to write that in or like stress about it too much at this point, but just know that they're both x, and you don't have an exponent listed. It's understood to be 1. I'll bring those down, and you don't have to do this step right here where you bring them down if you're able to do it in your head. I just like to show it as a method that you may use. So again, we're looking at 4x plus 5x. We're going to add or subtract the coefficients in front, keeping our x the same. So if I have 4 x's and I add 5 more, altogether I should have 9 x's, right? So we're just adding the like terms here. All right, we're almost done. We are now to our constant terms. So I have a positive 3 and I have minus 2. So it's like plus 3 minus 2. And you can really just think of this as pretty much straightforward subtraction, but you're still combining like things. These are both constants or numbers. 3 minus 2 will give me 1. And keep in mind, you must separate all your terms by the signs. So all terms are always separated by addition or subtraction signs. You determine the sign based on what sign your value is. So if it's a positive, you're going to put a plus. If it's a negative, you would put a minus. Now, our leading term doesn't have to have a sign unless it's negative. So if this were a positive 4x, you could just leave it, which is 4x squared. But anything behind it, you must have the signs to separate them. And when we get to this point, we will stop. We're not going to force it to go any further. You're done combining terms when you have at most one of each type. We have 1x squared, we have 1x, we have one constant. So we will stop there.